Hello everybody, welcome back to Chapter 1. We will be wrapping up this chapter with the discussion of some very important topics, the first of which is different types of economic systems. If I were to ask you, what kind of economic system do we have in the United States? What terms have you heard to describe it? You might say, capitalism? Well, that's true. Our economic system is actually called the market system economy, but it's based on the philosophy of capitalism. The philosophy of capitalism is the belief that it should be private companies, privately owned companies, that produce the goods and services in an economy. Well, what's the alternative, you might say? Well, what's another kind of economic system that you've heard about that's different from capitalism? You might say communism. Well, communism is based on the philosophy of socialism, and actually it's an example of extreme socialism. And with communism as an economic system, that's what's known as a command system economy. With a command system economy, the belief is we can't trust the production of goods and services to private industry. It should be the government that is producing the goods and services in the economy. That is what communism is. So when you look at this slide, it looks like we're being given two options. And the two options are answering the question, what should guide economic activity in an economy? Should it be what's known as the market mechanism? Should markets be left to guide economic activity on their own as supply and demand interact with each other in product markets? And we'll explain how that works in Chapter 3. That's the market mechanism. That is a feature of the market system economy, which is our style of economy. Or should it be government directive that is guiding economic activity? Should there be a central planning agency within the government that is telling producers how much to produce and what prices to sell the products at? That's what communism was. That is a command system economy. But it's not really a yes or no answer. It's more like a continuum. There are different types of economic systems which, all the way to the left are based more on capitalism or less on capitalism. And if you move to the right in this continuum, more towards government directive, there could be an economy that's somewhere in between these two. And in fact, what we currently refer to as a socialist economy is really, the ones that European style economies like France, for example, is considered a socialist economy, but it's really mostly a market system economy with some features of socialism. It's where most of the goods and services in that economy are being produced by private companies, but people of France believe that there are certain industries where the government should be producing the goods and services, or at least funding them. So they might choose certain industries that they feel are so essential to the welfare of the population that they can't trust that industry to private companies, private industry to produce. So they may choose for the government to produce healthcare, for example, or maybe fund healthcare, or maybe higher education, or maybe financial services, or maybe public transportation, something like that. So that is normally what's referred to as a socialist economy, somewhere in between extreme capitalism and extreme socialism. Extreme capitalism sometimes is referred to as laissez-faire capitalism, hands-off capitalism. So this is where the government is hands-off. Well, even market system economies believe that there's a role for the government. Government can't be completely uninvolved in the economy. There are certain basic functions you need the government to perform, which we'll talk about, like regulation. So you need the government to be minimally involved, but for the most part, with the market system economy, we believe that the government should not be producing most of the goods and services. That should be done by private companies, privately owned companies. Okay, so this is this discussion of two types of economies. And right now I'm going to take you way back to the person as considered to be really the original economist who came up with this idea of the market system economy. His name is Adam Smith. Was the original economist, and he came up with the market system theory. He wrote a very famous book called The Wealth of Nations, and he was Scottish. He was right there at the birth of the Industrial Revolution, which you may know started in England and then gradually spread throughout the world. So this is the second half of the 1700s. Took about another 100 years to reach the United States, and we'll talk more about the specifics of the Industrial Revolution in Chapter 2. But just briefly what this was the conversion or the transition from the cottage system of producing goods and services in an economy to the factory system. So prior to this, anything that was produced in an economy was produced in small batches in people's cottages. That's why it's called the cottage system. People would have workshops attached to their homes, and they would have a family business, and that they would produce things, and they would take them to the market, and they would trade them, and they would sell them, and they would buy what they needed. So there's all kinds of production happening in small batches by small producers. The factory system is where, for the first time, these large production facilities were being built. People were being hired as employees of the factory. So the factory then had owners, and the factories were producing in a much larger scale, and there's all kinds of efficiencies that you realize, what are known as economies of scale. We'll talk all about that in the next chapter, but this is the first time this was happening anywhere in the world, in England, in the second half of the 1700s. He was there for this very first economy that was based on the factory system, and he was thinking about essential questions like, what should be the role of government? Is it okay that these are private companies? These factories were owned by private individuals, industrialists. Is that okay? Should we have the government be more involved? Maybe the government should own the factories. She was asking these kinds of questions, and he decided that the government should not be involved. They should be minimally involved, and it should be markets that guide economic activity. It should be the interaction of people that make up the demand for the product and the companies that make up the supply of the product. This is what is known today as the market system. What's amazing is that 85% or more of economists today still think that Adam Smith got it right. And they have the benefit of history to look back on to base their opinion. Adam Smith had no history. This was the very first modern economy in England in the late 1700s. So this is known as the invisible hand theory. The operation of a market system creates a curious unity between private interests and social interests. A market economy allocates resources through decentralized decisions of many households and firms as they interact in markets. So what he meant was, there's nobody really in control of the whole thing. It's all decentralized decision making. Individual buyers, consumers, are making their purchase decisions based on what's best for themselves. And that's still true today. When you go to buy a car, do you think about what's best for society when you're making your purchase decision? You're thinking about what's best for you. You look at the price, you look at the benefits you're going to get from this car, any particular model, and then you do a value computation in your head, and you decide on the value of that particular car, and you compare it to the values of other alternative cars you could be buying. And then you buy the product, the car that has the most value for you. Every other buyer is doing the same thing. This is decentralized decision making. Nobody is collectively making decisions for the whole. Let's look on the supply side of that market. Who is telling the automobile manufacturers what to do? They are making their decisions based on what's best for the company. They're looking to maximize profits. They're going to produce the cars that will maximize profit. They're going to produce as many as they should to maximize profit. They're not concerned with society either, for the most part. So there's nobody really in control of all this. So the question is, who's looking out for society in this kind of economic system? Well, Adam Smith said, even though there's all this decentralized decision making going on, the market will be led as if by an invisible hand to promote general economic well-being, the best outcome for society. Now let me read to you from Wealth of Nations, and you're going to like this because this doesn't even sound like economics when you hear this, because none of the economic jargon had been invented yet. He was the original economist, so he uses very plain language, like talks about the butcher and the baker and the brewer. Okay, here we go. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. Nobody but a beggar chooses to depend chiefly upon the benevolence of his fellow citizens. So this is all this decentralized decision-making when people are interacting in a market that he's talking about. Every individual neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is, in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intentions. Nor is it always the worse for society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. So think about that. So why is it that the market system results in the best outcome for society? Let me start by asking you this question. Who tells the automobile industry what to produce and how much to produce? First, I'll tell you how this would work if this were a command system economy, communism. The Central Planning Agency would tell automobile manufacturers which models of cars to produce and what prices to charge for them and how many to produce. So there would be a central planning agency, and there might be, let's say in a fictional economy, 5 government automobile manufacturing plants producing cars. They would each be given production quotas, monthly production quotas, and be told what to produce and what prices to charge. And then those will be available on the market for consumers to go and buy. That's not how we do it, right? Who tells our automobile manufacturers which cars to produce and how many to produce and what prices to charge? It's all determined by the market. It's led by the consumer. It's led by consumer demand. And let's say that in the fictional market system economy, there are 5 automobile manufacturers. Well, consumers are going to have preferences, and they're going to purchase the automobiles that they desire. And so there's going to be a competition between these 5 automobile manufacturers. And each is going to be trying to best satisfy the needs and wants of consumers. And because there's competition, this is going to drive down the market price. If there's 5 government-owned automobile manufacturers, they don't really see themselves as being in competition with each other. They just see themselves as government manufacturers. They're like on this part of the same company, right? There's also no drive to lower production costs with the command system economy, with communism. These 5 auto manufacturers don't really need to be more productively efficient to lower their costs. With the market system economy, if these 5 manufacturers are in competition with each other, that gives you an advantage. If you can lower your costs, you might even be able to offer your product for a lower price, and that gives you an advantage. It makes you more profitable to lower your cost, right? There's no particular incentive to do that with communism. You're just meeting your production goals if you're a plant manager that are issued to you by central planning. So it's led by the consumer. But let's look at another example. Suppose you are a steel manufacturer. And let's say it's the market system economy. Who tells a steel manufacturer what to produce and how much of it? With the market system economy? Well, who do they sell their steel to? They sell their steel to other producers, right? It's an intermediate good. So they sell their steel. For example, a big customer would be the automobile industry. The auto industry buys a lot of steel from steel manufacturers. So the demand for steel is derived from the demand for automobiles, which is derived from the demand that consumers represent when they're making their purchase decisions. And if consumers decide not to buy so many new automobiles, and this is, a purchase like that is usually tied to general economic conditions. If it's a recession, people stop buying new cars. Well, then the demand for steel is going to be down. Another large customer of the steel industry is the construction industry. So commercial builders buy steel and they use it to build buildings. So the demand for steel, in part, is derived from the demand for commercial construction. So this is how an economy works, and I've just given you a two-step process, but it's much more complicated than that. Think of all of the suppliers that an automobile manufacturer purchases from other than just the steel industry, steel manufacturers. Well, with the command system economy, there is a central planning agency that is trying to figure this all out. Instead of just letting markets determine how much should be produced and what the prices should be, they try to figure that all out. So they try to figure out, well, first they'll say, this is how many cars we're going to produce with our 5 manufacturing plants, and so how much steel should we need? Well, let's figure that out, and let's then have the steel industry produce that much steel. And then do the same thing in the construction industry. Well, that's very difficult to do. I was a production engineer at the beginning of my career, and I used to do this on a very small scale. So I would have a production run of a given, and this was communication electronics. So it would be a small system, and I would have to figure out, and the production run might be a couple thousand units, but I have to figure out, I'd have a bill of materials, all of the materials that had to be ordered, and how many sub-assemblies and lots of electronic components would have to be ordered, and they'd have to be installed. Cables would have to be produced, fabricated, and then there was mechanical shops producing parts, and it goes in and out of inventory while the parts are waiting. The thing gets assembled at the end, and figuring out the timing of all of that. It's very difficult to do that efficiently and to do it well. Now try to do that for the whole economy. It's just impossible to do that well. But this is what communism is attempting to do. Rather than markets figuring out what the supply and demand should be for any given product and what the market price should be, they're trying to figure that all out. When we get to chapter 3, we're going to realize that leads to all kinds of inefficiencies, which in a market would be either surpluses or shortages. That's how you represent inefficiency in a market. So anyway, what we're doing here is we're comparing the market system economy that Adam Smith first came up with and is still used predominantly today in every economy that is productive, and the command system economy. That's still used today also. And we'll look at some economies that are still based on the command system economy, communism. So here is this invisible hand theory. Each of these households and firms acts as if led by an indivisible hand to promote general economic well-being. Now it's known as the market mechanism. It's the market mechanism that is guiding economic activity. Consumers, which make up the demand for a product in any product market, interact with suppliers, producers of that product, which represent the supply of that product to the market. They interact when the quantity supplied by suppliers is in balance with the quantity demanded by consumers. That then establishes a market price. We're going to learn about all of this in chapter 3. But this is what's known as the market mechanism. This will be the most efficient way for goods and services to be produced in the economy. So some features of the market mechanism or the market system economy. Efficiency. Resources will be allocated based on society's wants. Only the automobiles that people desire will be purchased, or they'll be purchased in larger quantities. or they'll sell for higher market prices. So then resources then will flow to the production of those types of goods and services. That's the way our market works. And that's what we would want, right? Incentives. There's an incentive for skill acquisition on the part of workers. Hard work innovation is rewarded. I forgot to mention entrepreneurism. There's no particular reward for the entrepreneur with communism. With communism, everything is owned by the government. The government owns the factors of production. They own the land, they own all the capital, they own the labor even, because their educational system tracks students in elementary school towards different paths, towards different careers. They're tested at that time. This is the way it was working. And so you had limited freedom to pursue the profession you wanted to pursue. And the entrepreneur, remember, what is it that incentivates the entrepreneur to strike out on his or her own and leave a stable job and start a company and act on his or her own innovative ideas? The incentive is profits. The profits go to the owner of the business. Well, there are no profits that go to owners of the business. The owner of the business in communism is the government. It all goes to the government. So there's no incentive to be entrepreneurial. So there's an absence of innovation. There's not as much innovation in the command system economy. And laissez-faire, you've heard me mention this a few minutes ago. Laissez-faire capitalism would be sort of an extreme version of capitalism where you think the government should be minimally involved and not doing much at all. So here is a study that is meant to measure people's favorability or unfavorability, or whether they agree with the market system economy or disagree with the market system economy. And here's the question. The free enterprise system and free market economy is the best system on which to base the future of the world. So here are the responses from different parts of the world. The U.S., 59% agree, 29% disagree. That's a little surprising. You would think that that would be more, we're considered sort of the predominant market system economy in the world, and yet 30% disagree that the market system is the best system for an economy. Canada, very similar. Brazil, more of a belief in the market system. And these are all fairly close. Germany, that's a little surprising because they are a more socialist economy. United Kingdom, similar to us. France, you can see they are considered the most socialist of the Western European economies, and this sort of reflects that in their responses. And you can look at the rest of those. The world average, we are about we're in line with the world average. So here are these three questions. What to produce, how to produce, for whom to produce. So with the market system economy, what is produced? The goods and services that consumers want the most, because that's where there will be the greater demand. And we're going to learn again in Chapter 3, if demand is increasing, that drives up the market price, makes it more profitable to produce this product, and more companies will produce it. There will be more competition, which is good for society. That brings the market price back down. How will it be produced? With the market system economy, private companies compete with each other. In order to be profitable, you would want to lower your production cost as much as possible. That increases your profit, right? What is profit? It's revenue minus expenses. If you could lower your expenses, then it increases your profit. And in fact, you might have to do that because if your competitors are lowering their operational costs, maybe based on some new technology that's been invented, and you choose not to do it, and you don't buy this new technology and use it, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage. And in fact, the market price may even come down to the point that you're not profitable at all, and then you'll have to leave the market, go out of business. For whom are goods and services produced? Whoever's willing and able to pay the market price. So let's talk about government directives. So this is an alternative way to design your market your economy. This is what's known as the command system. Well, two key economists, Karl Marx and John Maynard Keynes, both advocated for more government intervention, but to different degrees. John Maynard Keynes, much less of an advocate for government intervention, but he was one of the first to advocate with market system economies that the government should step in at certain points. And I'll tell you the history of each of these so you can kind of get some perspective. So let's start with Karl Marx. You probably heard this before. His teachings are what communism was based on. He wrote two very famous books. He came before John Maynard Keynes. The Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital emphasized how free markets tend to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of the few at the expense of the many. So he was worried that with the market system economy, which was a newer concept during his lifetime, had only been around for 50 years, let's say, he was worried about the people that owned the factories. So you had private owners of these factories. These were very powerful people. Maybe they will exploit the workers. This is what he was worried about. Wealth and power and authority then is concentrated in the hands of a few people at the top of the pyramid who own these factories, who own these companies. And so he thought that unfettered markets, meaning markets that were not being monitored and controlled by the government, would permit these capitalists, these owners of the factories, to enrich themselves while the proletariat, the workers, toil long hours for subsistence wages. He thought the government not only had to intervene, but had to own the means of production. They should own they should be the company that produces the goods and services, is what he was saying. And this is what communism is based on. It is the government that is producing the automobiles and the steel and any other product that is being produced, for the most part. Now, what he missed was, he was concerned with how these powerful industrialists, these capitalists that own the factories, could exploit the worker. They could become corrupt, in other words. What he underestimated, however, is maybe if it is the government producing goods and services and not these capitalists, now it is the government who is in control of the system, total control, and they can then be concerned about what's best for society. This is a noble aim, I think. So he had good intentions, but what he underestimated was the level of corruption that there would be in the government when you give all of this authority and power concentrated into few government officials. And so this was one of the main problems with communism. Corruption in the government. So corruption among industrialists was replaced by corruption among government officials. So John Maynard Keynes came much later, and actually he was born in the year that Karl Marx passed away. I think their lives overlapped by a couple of months. But he came much later. And he rose to fame during the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, in the United States, and remember he was in England, but it was a global depression, not just in the United States. He was jumping up and down. He was talking to his own prime minister and to our president at the same time. The government should be doing something. So our Great Depression happened in the early 1930s, 1929 through the first years of the 30s. And things got really bad. And the economists that were advising our president were telling the president, we have a market system economy. Adam Smith told us that markets will be flexible, that things will adjust. It's a self-adjusting system. It just takes time. So when there's some sort of economic breakdown, we shouldn't panic. The government shouldn't step in. Just wait for it to self-adjust. So it's 1 year in. Now it's 2 years in. And people are losing their life savings and banks are collapsing. Now it's 3 years in, 4 years in, 25% unemployment rate, higher than we've even had recently. And finally, our president started to take the advice of John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes said the government should step in and do something. Now, we do this all the time anymore. This is known as fiscal policy and monetary policy, but this was a brand new idea at the time. So he thought markets were pretty efficient most of the time at organizing economic activity, but sometimes the economy can veer off. Sometimes it's caused by some external thing that happens, like a war or a natural disaster. Sometimes it's some sort of problem within the economy. But in either case, the government can and should step in to, now in his words, act like a pressure gauge, letting off steam or building it up as the economy needed. That's language that you'll hear in this textbook. If the economy becomes overheated, that means we're producing too much and that's driving up prices and causing inflation. That's one kind of problem, so we need to slow down the economy. Or sometimes we need to build up pressure. We're not building enough. We're not producing enough in our economy. That's the more common problem recently. And then we need to do something to stimulate the economy. This is all the kinds of things we're going to talk about in this course. So this is common knowledge now that the government should step in and do these kinds of things. The only debate is how much of it should we do? The government should play an active but not all-inclusive role in managing the economy. Really, Keynes said that the government should step in when things are going badly and nudge the economy in a certain direction. This is what he was saying. This is known as I said today, fiscal policy and monetary policy. These are the last two things we're going to talk about in this course. Everything leads up to that discussion. So John Maynard Keynes really came out with these theories during the Great Depression. Finally, economies were paying attention to him, and this is now known, by the way, as Keynesian economics. So now, the market system economy, which now has the government intervening at certain times, is now what's referred to as a mixed market economy. It's mostly individual, private companies producing goods and services with the government stepping in at certain times, right? Even in our market system economy, though, think about this. Our government produces goods and services too, right? Even though we consider ourselves to be, very capitalist, think about what the government produces. There are certain industries where they are the whole industry. How about defense services, military services? They produce that. We don't trust that in the hands of private producers, right? Private industry. Even though they deal a lot and purchase a lot from private companies, defense contractors, still it's the government that is the defense industry. What else? Public education. Our government produces that. It collects tax dollars, and then they produce K through 12 education, so that the idea is that this way we're guaranteeing access to all children to at least K through 12 education. Some countries also guarantee through college. Countries like Germany. And of course you pay higher taxes to pay for that. But that is moving towards a more socialist style economy when you do that. Most economies have a mixed market. And again, think of it as a continuum. They're somewhere between extreme capitalism and extreme socialism or communism. They're somewhere in between. Most are closer to the market system economy side of that continuum. But this is a study on this next slide, which was attempting to rank countries based on how heavily they lean towards capitalism or in the other direction towards socialism or communism. The Index of Economic Freedom is updated every year, and it is put together by the Heritage Foundation, which collects economic data on all of the economies of the world. 50 different variables, 50 different criteria that they can use that each individually indicates whether an economy is open or closed, whether the government is minimally involved in the operation of the economy, in producing the goods and services, and regulating what gets produced, or whether the government is very involved or whether it is the government that is producing most of the goods and services, that will be a closed economy that puts you on the bottom of the list. So top of the list means you're an open economy, the government is not as involved. The bottom of the list, you're a closed economy, the government is very involved. And if the government places tariffs on imported goods, then that would put you towards the bottom of the list. If you are a free and open trading partner with other economies, then that puts you towards the top of the list. I mention that because we've slipped down out of the top 10 in the last couple years. Well, actually, we're number 10 in 2020, but we were higher. You might expect us to be higher because we are sort of the preeminent market system economy in the world, we think, and yet we're not in the top 10. But under the Trump administration, we increased our tariffs with several trading partners, several key trading partners, chiefly China, and so we slipped down a little bit. But you can see these other economies at the top of the list, and then you're only seeing the top 8 and the bottom 8, so most of the economies are somewhere in between. So we're close to the top of the list, number 10 in 2020. Sometimes there is a market failure, and this is, in fact, we just had a market failure, right? Which I guess you can call a natural disaster, the pandemic. It's almost like a weather-related disaster happened, except it was a pandemic. And now our government has stepped in. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this class, what our government did and how that compares to what our government has done during our history. Now, sometimes when the government is intervening too much, their intervention causes a failure, and that's known as government failure. Now, moving on to a separate topic, and this is mentioned just briefly at the end of Chapter 1. There is positive analysis and there is normative analysis. There's positive economics and normative economics. Positive economics, or a positive economist, would be someone who studies economic data and then uses that to support economic principles or economic concepts or economic laws. So based on historical data. Normative economics, normative analysis, is when you are making economic judgments about what should be done. So for example, our president has a council of economic advisors who advise him on what economic policy we should implement. They are normative economists. Now, I probably should have addressed this at the very beginning of Chapter 1. What's the difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics? And I've touched on this a little bit so far in Chapter 1, but let's take a look. Macroeconomics, we're interested in the macroeconomy. So we are interested in the national economy. We'll look at various macroeconomic measures that are measuring the health of the national economy, such as unemployment and inflation rate, and how much is being produced by the economy, or gross domestic product, whether that's going up or going down. These are all macroeconomic measures. And then we'll compare ourselves to other national economies, which then form a global economy. Studying that, and then we'll drill down as far as discussing individual product markets and industries, supply and demand within product markets and industries. That's macroeconomics. A little bit of an overlap with microeconomics, because with microeconomics, we start at the product market level or industry level, and then drill down further into the demand for that product and the supply of that product. So we talk more about how individual consumers within any given market make their purchase decisions. This is known as consumer behavior. And then we talk about how individual producers in that market make their production decisions. This is about the middle 50% of the microeconomics course, where we look at how producers behave. Of course, all of them have one objective: to maximize profit. But And then finally, I'm going to introduce you to the ceteris paribus assumption. As I said, we're going to be dealing with economic models. We're going to be constructing an economic model to prove a concept, and we're going to always have to say this assumption, ceteris paribus, other things equal, the assumption that nothing else is changing. Let me introduce you to an economic concept right now that's going to come up at the beginning of Chapter 3, the law of demand. The law of demand says that as the price of the product goes up, the quantity demanded by buyers is going to go down. And this makes sense, right? If the price goes up, you're going to want to buy less of it. If the price goes down, you're going to want to buy more of it. Other things equal. So to state that law the way I just did, you have to tag on the ceteris paribus assumption. So let me say it again. The law of demand says that as the price of the product rises, the quantity demanded decreases, ceteris paribus. And as the price of the product goes down, the quantity demanded by consumers will go up, other things equal, ceteris paribus. That is the ceteris paribus assumption that we'll always have to state with any law or concept. Okay, that's Chapter 1. I'm going to say goodbye for now, and I'll meet you again in Chapter 2.